¿Estamos? Buenas tardes. Estamos ya instalados. Tengo el placer y el privilegio de presentarles a una de las keynote speakers, que agradecemos mucho el tiempo, el viaje, así que esperemos que aproveche la estadía en Arica. La profesora Julie Conlin es profesora de Economía de la Universidad de California en San Diego. Tiene un doctorado en Economía del MIT, ha sido profesora en la Universidad de Michigan, fue profesora visitante en Northwestern, tiene un destacadísimo currículum, así que perdería 5 minutos más diciéndole todo lo que ha hecho. Su especialidad es Economía de la Educación, Public Economics, Taxes, Behavioral Responses, lo que nosotros hoy día diríamos un Applied Micro, ¿no es cierto? Una economista aplicada. Estamos de verdad muy contentos, muy agradecidos. The floor is yours. Y nos va a contar Ability Mismatch and Early Career Success. Muchísimas gracias. Un aplauso para el video.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be invited to the conference. And I've been here since yesterday, had some time to look around the city, and have enjoyed all of the sessions I've been in so far today. And I've learned that a lot of you have ties to San Diego, so whether it's students or getting educated or visiting. So the talk that I'm going to give today is a little different from probably what a usual keynote talk is like. Much of my research has been in the economics of education, and I've looked at mostly the elementary and secondary level and how different systems, so including the way the schools are funded, school accountability systems, how those systems affect the efficiency of schooling provision. This is going to be, so I might give an overview of some of the work that I've done in that area. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm presenting a very current research paper, and it's on a topic that's a little bit aside from my expertise. So still closely related because it's going to be looking at things like related to education. But the main question that I'm going to look at is about, I think it's a classic labor market economics question, which is how workers are matched to jobs affect their career trajectories and their outcomes. Okay, so classic labor market question, but I generally don't do labor economics research. Okay, so this is the title of the paper that I'll be drawing from, and it's co-authored with my colleague Gordon Dahl, who is a labor economist, and with a student of ours. So Richard DeThorpe was actually an undergraduate student at UC San Diego, has gone on to Princeton for a PhD, and he's co-authoring on this project with us. And just this collaboration with this junior scholar also made me think about how well this society supports junior scholars, so I've seen it in the sessions that I've gone to. And I think it's really wonderful to mentor the next generations. Okay, so this, I wanted to start, so it's going to be an unusual context for you all, where I'm going to start showing you what we're able to evaluate with respect to job mismatch. But I wanted to start by talking about what job mismatch rates look like in Chile. Okay, so the figures that are shown here is there different ways of measuring how workers are mismatched to their job, and this comes from OECD analysis. Okay, so OECD surveys adults based on the skills that they have, so the math, the literacy skills, level of education, and asks them, for example, underqualified, so the blue bars are going to be the fraction of workers, this is going to be adult workers, that report that they have a level of education that's below what's typically needed for their job. Okay, so this is based on education levels. Overqualified, blue bars, Chile, orange bars are going to be the average for the OECD, just so you can see the comparisons. Okay, but the rates of underqualification are around 12%. Overqualified, which means I have a higher level of education than typically needed, those rates are around 17%. And then the next two categories define it by skills. So underskilled means that I have fewer skills than are, so I'm missing some skills that are typically needed for my job. And in Chile, the most common missing skills that people report are related to computer use, software use, and then also leadership skills. Okay, but the underskill rates are relatively low, so that's around 6%. And then overskill rates are actually quite high. Because overskill means there's skills that I have, and that I've pulled together that I don't get to use on my job. And you can think of that as we're underutilizing some of the human capital that a person has. Okay, and the last category is mismatch to the field of study. And that's more than a third, okay, or mismatch to field of study. And what that means is that the degree associated with the highest level of education, or sorry, the field associated with the highest level of education does not match the primary field that would be needed for the job. Okay, and so all of these show you that mismatch is very common. Okay, it's not unusually uncommon in Chile relative to the typical OECD country. Okay, but there are, I know there's a lot of studies. I did use ChatGPT to ask, what are the most pressing labor market issues in Chile, and one that came up was mismatch. Okay, and I've seen some reference to expansions in the education system that haven't ended up matching expansions in job opportunities. And so rates of higher education accumulation, just the opportunities aren't there for those folks. And so overeducation, I think, has been an issue. But why do we care about mismatch? Is we care from a macro perspective that it could affect productivity, right, and underutilization of human capital, as I said before. From a micro perspective, it could affect workers' trajectories, right? If I'm not utilizing all my human capital, if I get matched to a job that doesn't use my skills, I might be paid less than I otherwise would. And so what are the kinds of policies that we could use to try to address this? Is, one I think probably particular to Chile is to try to get more coordination between the education system and employers, so in the labor market, so that the skills that are being produced match what's demanded in the job market. There could be more training for later career workers if their skills have become obsolescent. So there's, anyway, a lot of ways we could think about of trying to improve, including information for young individuals about the job opportunities and what's needed out there. Okay, so this is kind of a broad overview of mismatch. It's been measured in many different ways. And now I'm going to dive really narrowly into how we're going to measure it in this paper. So we're going to define it in a very specific way. Okay, so in this paper, we're going to define mismatch based on cognitive skills. Okay, and you'll see that our measure is going to be like an SAT score. So it's going to be your average math and verbal aptitude level. Mismatch is going to be how does own ability compare to the average ability in a job. Okay, and this is something that people have used before as characterizing jobs by their incumbents. Okay, so if you're overskilled or overqualified, and these words might be offensive because it's not quite the right word for what we're talking about, right? So it's not based on qualifications, but I'll say overqualified means your cognitive ability is above the average for your job. Underqualified, it's below. And the literature has often assumed or imposed that both deviations in both directions are bad. Okay, and that's basically that mismatch has often been measured as an absolute value, right? How different are you from the typical person in the job? And that makes sense if you think someone who's overqualified, maybe they get demotivated, they don't work as hard at the job, so it's bad for their outcomes on the job. For someone who's underqualified, maybe they don't have the ability to learn the job skills. The rate of learning is slower, and that worsens their outcomes. Okay, but it could just as easily go the other way, which is if I'm underqualified, maybe I'm really motivated to perform well at this job. So I rise to the challenge, and I work really hard, and I learn faster, and I catch up to other workers. And if I'm overqualified, maybe I'm really motivated by how easy it is for me to learn, and to excel and do better than others. Okay, so I think it's really an empirical question of what direction either of these effects go. Okay, so something we're going to do in this paper is we're going to let those have different effects. Right? We're not going to constrain them to operate in the same way. Something I should have asked really early on is if you guys want, you can throw questions in anytime, or we could wait till the end. But I'm happy just to take questions as they pop up. So feel free to jump in. Okay, so this, where we're going to look at this is at the beginning of an individual's career, and soon you'll see the odd setting that we're using. But the setting is going to have some nice features that are going to let us try to get at the causal effects of mismatch. Okay, so we're going to look at early vocational training and how job skill acquisition happens during that phase, and then once they're on the job, how the rates of learning the job knowledge evolve. We'll also look at job performance and whether the individual's retained in the job or not. So it's going to look at retention. And finally, we have promotion decisions. Okay, so there's a first competitive promotion process, and we'll see whether individuals succeed at that level or not. Okay, so we have a variety of outcomes that we can track for these individuals. Okay, so the key empirical challenge in this setting, so in evaluating the effect of mismatch on workers, is the obvious one, which is self-selection into jobs. Right, so if you observe someone in a job who appears to be mismatched on whatever dimensions you're going to measure it on, it may be that they're very well matched on some dimension that can't be measured. Right, so maybe that they're well suited in terms of preferences, even if it appears on observable skills that they're poorly suited. Okay, so this self-selection issue is very thorny in the real world. Okay, that if we're looking at individuals and seeing how their careers evolve, that if they're evolving based on these unobserved variables, it's going to be tricky to map that back to mismatch. Okay, so what our solution is going to be, and this is where I said the context is probably going to be very unfamiliar to most of you, it was unfamiliar to me, is going to be in the context of the US Air Force. And so the US Air Force, the way it operates is folks come in weekly, so there's weekly entry cohorts. They go through basic training, which you've probably seen in the movies, where they're yelled at, et cetera, and just made to, start thinking about their non-civilian lifestyle. And they're assigned jobs. They then go on and get technical training for their job, and then work, or continue to evolve on their job, so perform on the job. So the interesting thing about the Air Force is that it provides technical training that's very similar to what community colleges do. Okay, these individuals receive credits that they can work towards advanced degrees. Okay, so this employer, which is the US Air Force, is part community college and then part like a really large diversified firm. So it has a lot of jobs under its hood that individuals can perform. And so I'll explain more about the kind of quasi-random variation we're going to use. But the nice thing is it collects a lot of data on individuals prior to job assignments. Okay, so it measures aptitudes and skills, and then assigns jobs, and then tracks their outcomes. Okay, so we have information kind of on the whole cycle. And then I'll explain the quasi-random assignment to jobs. Okay, so as I said, we're going to define, I'm going to use this word relative ability. We're going to use something, and if you've worked with any of the survey data in the US, you probably are aware of this measure, the AFQT. It is, so it's the Armed Forces Qualifying Test Score. It is very, very similar to the SAT in that it has math and verbal components, and then it just comes up with a composite score. Okay, and this AFQT score is nationally normed. So if someone has a 0.5, that means they're at the 50th percentile nationwide. Okay, so that's nationally normed aptitude score. So we're going to take this own AFQT score relative to the average in the job. And I'm going to call it an ability surplus if own ability exceeds that average, ability deficit if it's below. Okay, we're going to want to look at the effects of both of those types of mismatch. So the way we're approaching this question, and this is different from what others have done, is that we're going to control very flexibly for my own score. Okay, so we want to think of you as comparing me, who has either some sort of surplus or deficit, to someone of the same ability level who has a different surplus or deficit. So how does that happen? It can only happen because we're in different jobs. Okay, so our variation is going to be coming from people who are put in more and less cognitively demanding jobs. Okay, and so it's going to be, we're forcing the difficulty level of a job to operate through this mismatch measure. Okay, but we're going to be comparing people otherwise who have the same ability levels. Okay, and so that's what I mean by the effects of this mismatch. By design, the way mismatch comes about is through the job that I'm assigned, right? The job difficulty level. So that's what is driving variation in mismatch for individuals. Okay, so what is our identification strategy? And I think this is really one of the main contributions of the paper, is that when an individual signs up for the Air Force, they aren't applying to a specific job posting. Right, they come in, there's a set of available jobs that are out there. They have a set of skills, most of which we see. And then this matching process takes place between individuals and available jobs. Okay, so the fact that I don't apply to a specific job, like in the real world, people are applying to job postings. Right, here I'm applying to this employer, and then the employer is telling me, here's the job that you're going to receive of those that are available. Okay, so that's, I think, the main advantage that we have is that there's this matching between individuals and available jobs. There's some things we don't see. So we don't see an individual's preference ranking. Okay, so I can rank the set of jobs that are available. The Air Force can see my qualifications, my preferences. When they do this process, it's actually called the job spin. So it sounds like it has some quasi-random variation in it. Okay, we don't see the preferences. And so if we see someone who is really overqualified, it's likely that they had a preference for this type of job that they're observed in. And so we're going to try to isolate job assignment variation that comes just from the arriving cohort, so the people that I'm competing with for the set of jobs that are available and the set of jobs that are available. Okay, and those depend on what the slots are that are coming up in technical training, like the equivalent of the community college. Okay, so we'll take the set of people I'm competing with, the set of jobs that are available, and we're going to simulate perfect assortative matching, okay, which is what would minimize mismatch. Okay, well, I'll put the highest ability person in the most cognitively demanding job, and so on. And so that wipes out the part that comes from preferences, okay, and is just using variation in who I'm competing with and which jobs are available. So if I end up being very overqualified, it's because the set of jobs that were available weren't very cognitively demanding, or I'm competing with a cohort that was particularly strong. Okay, and we'll circle back. So I'll talk more about the identification strategy. Okay, so what we find, and as I said, it was ambiguous going in, whether one would be good, one would be bad. What we end up finding is that they're both good on some dimensions and both bad on other dimensions. It's just that they're the opposite. Okay, so if I have an ability surplus, so that means I'm overqualified, then what we observe is that those individuals tend to do poorly on what we think of as kind of global or common outcomes. Okay, so they're more likely to attrit from the military, and you don't get to decide you're stepping out. You attrit because they push you out. Okay, so they're more likely to not perform poorly enough or do something that gets them kicked out of the Air Force. They do not do as well on general knowledge exams that everyone takes, because everyone has to take exams on military knowledge, so they're not doing well on those. They're acting up, okay, poor behavior, criminal incidents. But when it comes to learning their job, so if they look at the score on their job knowledge, they do better than the others that are in the same job. Okay, so when it comes to job-specific outcomes, they have an advantage compared to those others that they're competing with. And when I say this, I don't want you to think of them competing next to each other. They get scattered across the globe, right? But when they're coming up for promotion, they're competing with other people in the same position. And then if you flip it, if we look at skill deficit, we find individuals are apparently, so if I'm put in a job that's more cognitively demanding, they put forth a lot more effort, less likely to attrit, act better, learn more on the general knowledge exam, but then can't compete when it comes to promotion. Okay, so they're learning the amount of job knowledge they'd obtained is less, and they aren't competitive when it comes to the tournament. Okay, so that's just a summary of the patterns across the two. Okay, and we'll in the end we'll talk about what that means for employers, because it depends on what the benefits and costs are each of these things. Like, how costly is attrition? How costly is it to retrain somebody? Do you want to keep the best and the brightest, so you really care who you're promoting are the most excellent. So it's going to depend on the costs and benefits of all these different margins, which we have estimates for some, but not for all. Okay, so that's the broad outline of what the project is. And so I think the going in, like, we'll just acknowledge this is not the labor market in the wild, right? This is a specific labor market. It is big. Okay, there's 400 individuals come in every week, and so there's a lot of people being processed through the Air Force, and the Air Force markets itself actually as providing useful job skills, okay, as sort of like a job training, that join the Air Force, learn good skills, and have a successful future career. Okay, but it is, the salaries are the same for everybody while they're in the Air Force. Right, they're paid the same as long as they continue to advance up the ranks and steps, so it's not job specific. And so part of what we'll show at the end is the motivation for these two different groups is those that are overqualified are in jobs that, compared to someone with the same cognitive ability who's well matched to their job, that job in the outside world is going to have a lower salary. Okay, so their future prospects are lower when they're overqualified, and the reverse is true when you're underqualified. Okay, so those future careers prospects may be providing the motivations that we see here, and that I think would translate to the real world, right? Just be in real time, that the job that I'm in is going to be coming with higher or lower wage rewards. Okay, as far as the related literature, so I know that some of the folks here at the conference have studied mismatch in the Chilean context. There's most of the literature that I know well is in the US context. And I think we're between kind of two literatures. One looks at mismatch in higher education, and that's the difference between an individual's ability level and kind of the quality level of the college that they go to. And in the US, that literature started by looking primarily through the affirmative action lens, which is where individuals who normally wouldn't qualify based on their academic record to attend a given school were given an extra boost to give into the school. Okay, and so the literature looked at it kind of just from one direction, that what happens if I'm at a school where I'm less academically prepared than other individuals. Okay, and a tricky thing with that literature is that along with that difference in my match to the school, so if you just want to say, am I less academically prepared or not, it's usually true that the schools that are more demanding, say have higher average SAT scores, also are more resourced. Right? So the treatment involves other things, right? For us, we're looking at a single employer and different jobs rather than different institutions that themselves induce differences in match quality. Okay, but this literature has moved on to look at things like mismatch to majors, which in a way I think is closer to what we're doing. Because that's within a university, seeing whether individuals that are in a major that seems to match their skills or abilities well or not. Okay, and that literature has primarily used regression discontinuity designs, where you're barely rationed into your favorite or barely rationed out. And so by design, those folks that they're studying by our definition, are probably going to have a skill deficit, right? Because they're right on the margin of getting into the major. It's usually ranked by some ability dimension, and these are going to be the folks who barely get in. Okay, so it's again looking at a specific population or specific dimension of mismatch. Okay, and then there's also studies looking at the mismatch between, and this is where I think it's probably very relevant to the Chilean context, between the major that an individual has and then the job that they get in the labor market. And that's, I think some of the most interesting studies there have used variation that comes from cyclical patterns. Okay, so that there's a long literature showing that if you graduate during a recession, that it has long-lasting scarring effects. Some of those scarring effects appear to come from the fact that individuals are more likely to be mismatched. Okay, that they're on any of these dimensions that we talked about, education, skills, or otherwise. Okay, but the challenge there is that the variation in mismatch also embeds the effects of a recession. Okay, that I haven't seen studies that have been able to separate those two. Okay, and then as far as in the labor literature, so there's a really long literature on job mismatch. And some of what the trajectory has been is in how mismatch is defined. Okay, so early on, I think most of the literature on mismatch in the labor market used education. Okay, that do you have a higher than average education or lower than average education? So looking at over and undereducated. And some of the advances have been measuring match on more dimensions, okay, on multiple skill dimensions using either average skills, cognitive skills of people in a job, or something like the ONET, which you may know of, which experts are asked, do you need this skill in this job, or how much do you need this skill in the job? So mapping out all of the skills in a job. And so the measure of mismatch has gotten much more varied and multidimensional. But two studies that are most closely related to us, because they're looking at the start of a career, argue that if you look at the start of a career, there's not much information available about the quality of that first match. Okay, so basically argue you can think of initial mismatch as being quasi-randomly assigned and find evidence potentially consistent with that, which is those that are mismatched on their first job don't have lower wages than those that are well-matched. And then as they progress, you start seeing different career trajectories. Okay, more likely to attrit from the job if they're mismatched, and then kind of along with the scarring effect, slower wage growth over time. Okay, that initial poor match dampened the trajectory of their career. And so one's done in Sweden, and the other one's using data from the US. And there's a lot of really good work that, rather than relying on just the data and this observed trajectories, it puts on top structural models. Okay, and then the structural models can help overcome some of these selection biases as well. Okay, but we're not in the structural model tradition. What we're going to be doing is going to be quasi-experimental. And so what we think we're bringing to this literature, and if you know of a paper that I don't know of, please email me because I'd love to know what else is out there, is that we haven't seen other papers that have quasi-random variation in job assignments at the start of the career. And so I think for us, that's the primary contribution is probably on the identification front. So bringing a quasi-experimental approach to this mismatch literature. Okay, so I said that, so you can read it again. But it's the other nice things about the setting is just how rich the information environment is, being able to see things like skill accumulation and these retention and promotion outcomes. So I think of it as equivalent to attainment and achievement. Right? Attainment outcomes like persisting, achievement is how much am I learning on the job. And in the private sector, what people typically use as the proxy for match quality is wages. Right? And that could be a great proxy for productivity on the job. Okay, in our setting, wages aren't a good proxy because everyone's paid the same amount. Okay, but we do have these kind of direct measures of skill accumulation. Okay, and then as I said before, that we're not, the studies I mentioned that look at the beginning of the career and the effects of mismatch, where their functional form identification comes from, is they can look at people who, allow ownability level to have its own effects on job paths, allow jobs to have their direct effects, by even comparing people in the same job. So you could have job fixed effects. But then mismatch ends up being the absolute value. Okay, so it's identified by this assumption that it's distance from the average that matters. And so something we're going to do is not impose that. It comes at these other costs I mentioned before, right? That we're not going to be able to allow job difficulty to matter other than through the way it matters for job mismatch. Okay, so a little more about this setting is we think of it as a large diversified company that also offers this kind of formal vocational training. So it is college credit-bearing courses that are being taught. There's formal classworks. And then there's also formal on-the-job training so that when people are in their jobs, okay, they continue learning on the job. And there's a large emphasis on continuing education. That these individuals can take courses, and if you continue to further your education, that's one of the things that matters when it comes time for promotion. Right? They have to have moved far enough up the skill ladder and the education ladder to be eligible for promotion. So there's more than 130 jobs, and they're spread across 4 different fields. Okay, so there's mechanical, administrative, general, and electronics. I wouldn't have known this, so I'm going to be talking about enlisted personnel. So these aren't folks who are flying planes. Okay, there's a different way to get into the plane flying category. These are the people managing all of the operations. Okay, managing security, taking care of the planes, handling the communications, logistics of material movements. So these are the types of jobs, and individuals when I'll describe this a little bit more in a second, but when they come in and are assessed, they pick a career field. Okay, so we think about people, the relevant job market for individuals is people who are competing in the same career field at the same time. Okay, and what's unique about this company is how top-down this job allocation process is. Right, that I do get some input, so I'm going to be counseled. All these measures of my skills are taken. The jobs that are available, I'll learn about them, and I get to rank like 10 different jobs and a career field. So I choose the career field, and then I rank 10 different jobs within them. And then I think I'll say this now just because it'll come up again, but I'll skip it then, is that for some folks, when I end up being called up to duty, right, so they say, okay, your basic training slot is ready, come on. They tell me, and here's your job. And that's for like 2/3 of the people. When they head off for that first stage of basic training that's common, they know what job they have. The other third, they say, okay, we're ready if you come on in, and we promise you a job in that career field. Okay, but I don't know which one. And then those folks are the ones that literally go through the job spin at the basic training. Okay, so where they're competing over whichever jobs haven't been assigned yet. And that structure just gives the Air Force more flexibility with dealing with attrition, right? So not everybody gets through basic training, and not everybody gets through that next stage of training, which is where they're formally doing coursework relevant to their job. And so they need to deal with dropouts and repeats in the technical training course. Okay, so that gives them some flexibility. Okay, so this, the fact that there's some input from candidates, but it really is largely top-down, is very different from what most companies do. Right? You're going to apply for a specific post, and either you're found acceptable for that post or not. Okay, so this, how do I get linked up with the Air Force in the first place? And so I go to a military processing station, and that's where, I will have first met with the recruit somewhere, maybe at a high school. I should say the folks we're looking at, the folks who enter the Air Force are between 18 and 24, so pretty young. Sort of thinking of it as the beginning of their careers. And I've met a recruit somewhere who said, has talked me into this could be a good idea. I go to this processing station. They measure my, I take these cognitive tests, medical evaluations to make sure, I'm physically fit enough, and I get this career counseling. Okay, some folks are kicked out at this phase because they don't have a high enough AFQT score. Okay, so you need to have a minimum AFQT score to be eligible to serve. Okay, but then based on my skills, then I'm counseled about what might be my skills, my preferences, which jobs I might like, and I make that list. Okay, I then go into, I formally enlist. Okay, so I say, okay, I'm enlisting, and then I wait to be called up. Okay, and then I'm called up, and that's where I'm told either the job I got or which career field I'll get, and I start basic training. Okay, after I finish basic training, which is about 6 weeks, then folks go to their separate, they all train in the same place, so everyone who enters the Air Force trains on the same base. Then we go to wherever the training for our specific job is. Okay, so kind of scatter for our job. Once we finish our technical training, which is usually 3 to 4 months, and usually shorter than 6 months, then we're on the job. Okay, we're in our posts and performing our job, and can be kind of scattered across the globe. Okay, so what is the group that we're looking at? So we're going to be following all cohorts who entered between 2002 and 2006, and we can see those cohorts for up to 6 years. Okay, so in the short run, we're only going to be able to study folks who graduated from basic training. So we're looking at people who made it through basic training, because those are the folks for whom, in our data, we can see which job they were assigned, okay, which job they go off to do technical training. So for that, we have about this technical training is what I was saying is the 3 to 6 months after they graduate basic training. What we see is whether they graduate. Okay, 94% graduate. Only 80% graduate on time. Okay, so if you don't graduate on time, what that means is that you've got to go back and you've got to repeat this coursework. Okay, and of course that part's going to be costly. And then we're going to have 6% though that drop out at this phase, and dropout's costly too. The last outcome that we have is that there's, for every technical training course, there's a final grade. Okay, and that final score, we're going to create this composite outcome. Since we have attrition, our composite good outcome is that you took the test, right? So you graduated technical training, and you scored above average on that technical training exam. Okay, and so that's why 43% is less than half, right? That this is both graduating technical training and scoring above average. So these are, so I think having the technical training grade is very interesting. And when I was talking about doing well, learning on the job, this is one of those proxies for it. Okay, that after this technical training, how much knowledge do you have? So how do you do as far as having learned the relevant material for the job that you have? So the medium run, these are outcomes that are 2 to 3 years. So we're going to look at both 2-year and 3-year attrition. Okay, so have you attrited? And behavior, which is criminal incidents. So have you had any criminal incidents within 2 to 3 years? And then our relatively long run outcome is going to be 4 to 5 years after entry. And this is the first movement up the ranks that's competitive. Okay, that individuals are competing with other people in the same job for the set of available slots in that job. And that's just going to depend on, what Congress has authorized, who's retired from the higher ups. So just which openings are available. but that's super competitive. Okay, so among those who are competing for the first time for promotion, the promotion rates are about 30%. Okay, and they're competing with people who've been, tried before and weren't successful. So they're not just competing with their own cohort, they're competing with older cohorts as well. And so what we can see as a first positive outcome is I'm eligible for promotion. That means I've moved far enough up the skill ladder. I've taken the relevant promotion tests. So that means that's a good outcome, so I'm promotion ready. And then we have these different types of exams. So one is this the general military knowledge exam I was talking about. So that's an input to the promotion decision. And we have every person takes an exam that's specific to their job. And so that's the job kind of skill and knowledge score. Okay, so I take these two exams. Those are inputs to the promotion decision. The most recent annual performance evaluations, okay, which are how well am I performing on my job in the field, and that's by my supervisor, that those also play into the promotion decision. Okay, so, and they're typically scored out of 5, and people usually get 5 out of 5. Okay, so we're going to look at, did you get perfect performance evaluations? And then promoted in our sample is 18% because of attrition, right? That you have to have stayed, be eligible for promotion to be promoted. Okay, but those are the outcomes we're going to look at across the time horizons. Okay, so how we define relative ability, so I've alluded to this before, is we're going to take my AFQT, so AFQTI, minus the average for those who are in my job. Okay, and we're going to do a leave one cohort out version. And so the job market is going to be the people who entered the same week as me, who are in my career field. Okay, so when I say job market or cohort, I mean entry week times career field. Okay, so we're going to leave that group out because we don't want to characterize jobs in a way that depends on what the actual assignments in my cohort were. Okay, so it's average across all other cohorts in that job. And what else? I think that's all you need to know. Okay, so that's relative ability. And you can think of that as a kind of continuous measure of match or mismatch. Okay, and sorry, I'll describe what's there because I know the headings are hard to read. So what these two are doing is showing you the distributions of individual AFQTs and the job average AFQTs. Okay, the first graph here is individual AFQT percentiles. It ranges in the x-axis from 0.2 to 1. If the folks who joined this employer were, random draw from the U.S. population, this would be a uniform distribution, right? Because this is a nationally normed exam. You'll see that there's, it's truncated from below, and that's because of this minimum entry requirement, right? That I need a minimum score to be eligible to serve, and then it drops off. As you get to higher ability levels, the representation drops off. Okay, that it's not attracting folks from the very top end of the ability distribution as often as in the more middle levels of the ability distribution. Those spikes that you see aren't a feature of our data or sample. They're a feature of the way the AFQT is normed. Okay, so there's rounding across the bin. So if you looked at the national sample, you'd see these bizarre spikes. Okay, so that's not the data. That's just the AFQT percentiles. And then on the other side is showing the distribution of the job AFQT percentiles. And so that's just the average AFQT percentile of people in the job, weighted by our individuals. Okay, so this is the jobs that the individuals are facing. And the bottom number there is 0.5, I think. 0.5, yeah. And then above is like between 0.5 and 0.8 is where you see most of the distribution. Okay, so that the average AFQT is between 0.5 and 0.8 across these jobs. And the spikes you see here are something about our setting, which is there's some jobs that are more common than others. Okay, and that's where we'll see the spikes in the distribution. Okay, what these figures are showing is what this measure of mismatch, so this relative ability, what the distribution looks like in our population. Okay, on this side, it's just the raw measure. So my own AFQT minus that leave one out, average AFQT. And you can see in that distribution, it's pretty dispersed. Some of that dispersion is coming from individuals with different AFQTs. Low ability individuals are going to be more likely to be underqualified, and high ability individuals are more likely to be overqualified. And I think the 90-10 in that figure of relative ability is about from minus 0.17 to plus 0.17. Okay, so pretty well spread as far as percentiles. In that other figure, what we've done is to try to look at the variation that's more closely linked to what we actually use in the analysis. Okay, so we regress relative ability on a flexible function of own, AFQT, and then we take the residuals. Okay, so it's just taking out the direct effect of ownability, and then we're plotting that residualized relative ability measure. And so you can see, not surprisingly, it's a lot more narrow. Okay, so this is saying, you know, what's the variation among people with the same ability level? But there's still substantial variation. So the 90-10 in that figure on that side is minus 0.1 to plus 0.1. Okay, so still a wide variation in this relative ability measure among people with the same skill level. So what this figure is trying to show, and you may be able to see from afar, it's week by week by week, showing the average AFQT of the individuals that are competing in that week, and the average job AFQT, so the average skill level of the jobs that are available to that cohort. The peer variables are the hollow ones, so if you can see the hollow, and the job means are the solid. And so what that's showing you is that week by week, these things bounce around. Okay, they do generally tend to move together, but there's variation in both, you know, the average ability levels of the individuals who are competing in the market and of the jobs that are available to the cohort. Okay, and it's that variation that we're going to be using when we construct our instruments. Okay, so we've got that relative ability measure. What we choose to do for, and this is a functional form choice, is we're going to look separately at positive values and negative values. Okay, so we're going to look at surplus, so what S will stand for is ability surplus, and that means relative ability is positive, and if it's positive, it's going to be that, whatever that number is. Okay, 0 if I have a skill deficit, otherwise it's this positive number. Skill deficit is going to be defined as the absolute value of relative ability. So a larger deficit, you know, is going to be a more positive number, but that means I'm further below the job average. Okay, so those are the two key variables that we're going to use in our empirical analysis. And I should say, this functional form imposes a bend, right, or, you know, so some sort of change when I go from negative to positive. And we've tried alternative functional forms like quintiles, and the quintile estimates line up well with these estimates that have a more parametric structure. So we're running with this, but we have tested sensitivity to other functional forms. So yeah, you definitely can't see this, but what I put this here so I can remember what to tell you. So this is just a summary statistics table, but there's about 90,000 people in our sample, so 90,000 individuals whose careers we're tracking. The types of variables we have about them are the options that they took when they enlisted, because we know how long the contract was that they were signed, which varies depending on things like the number of education credits they have going in. We know the amount of education that they have. We know aspects about their physical capabilities, okay, whether they had any health limitations, whether they were overweight, and then demographic variables, so their age, education, and family status, as well as race, ethnicity, and gender. And I guess what are the other things that's useful to know here? So in this sample, the average AFQT is 0.67, so their average person is at the 67th percentile of the nationally normed distribution, so they are relatively skilled. And the ability surplus, so this will be useful to get in your minds, is conditional on having an ability surplus. The mean is about 0.11, okay, that I'm 11 percentage points above the average for the job. That also happens to be the standard deviation of ability surplus and ability deficit. So what I taught, you know, when you want to think about quantifying the results that you look at, think about multiplying them by 0.1. Okay, and that'll be the effect of a 1 standard deviation move or a 10 percentage point change in ability surplus or deficit. Okay, so turning to our regression model. So we're going to be running OLS regressions, or I should say linear regressions, and we're going to compare ordinary least squares and IV results. Okay, where our two key variables of interest are going to be the surplus measure and the deficit measure. And so the coefficients we're interested in is beta 1 and beta 2. Right, the effects of ability surplus and ability deficit. We're going to control flexibly for own AFQT. In the results I'll show you today, it's just a cubic in AFQT, but our results are robust to putting in, making it very non-parametric and just putting in indicators for every level of the AFQT. The individual characteristics are the ones I just described, so those are observed at entry and not affected by any experiences on the job. And finally, we include career field by year fixed effects, that's the alpha C, to try to pick up changes over time in what the work environment might be like for different career fields due to things like deployments or changes in what the US military is doing. Okay, so a few comments about this. Okay, so the first is what I was describing before about identification, that we can't, we're controlling for these two measures of mismatch, so these two pieces of mismatch, own AFQT, so we can't feasibly also control for the difficulty level of the job, right, that AFQT bar, the average in the job, because that would be collinear with what we have here. Right, so we can't do it. It's entering through the surplus and the deficit measures. Okay, so, and it's really just the way we define the question, where we're asking for individuals at the same ability level, how does being put in a more difficult, more cognitively demanding or less cognitively demanding job affect their outcomes? One thing we thought about with our setting is we see a lot of what the employer uses to assign individuals to jobs. Right? We have a lot of these measures of skills that are observed at entry. And so we thought if we, conditioning on these, we might be able to largely eliminate selection bias without doing anything fancy. Okay, but we do know that the preferences are taken into account and we can't see them. Okay, so even in this setting where we observe a lot of what goes into the match, we were still worried about unobserved selection into jobs based on preferences. Okay, and so that's where we're going to move to this instrumental variables strategy. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to simulate job assignments. Okay, so we take everyone competing in a job market. We rank the individuals by their AFQTs. We rank the jobs by their average AFQTs, and we just slot individuals into the job that has the same rank as they do. Okay, and then once we have that simulated job, we can calculate simulated relative ability. Okay, so just my ability less the average for the job I'm simulated to be put in if there were perfect assortative matching. From that simulated relative ability, I can calculate the two instruments I need, which is simulated deficit and simulated surplus. Okay, so it's really just coming through this, kind of algorithm for matching people to jobs, okay, where we're not taking account of preferences, right? We're pushing those away and saying, we know one of the key things that's used is cognitive ability. And so what would happen if that's all the military were using for these job assignments? So I saw a paper earlier today, just in the session before this, that I'm trying to think of what it's referred to as a recentered instrument, right? Where we could, yes. And that's a different approach we could take, where you basically calculate what the simulated value is in this market, and then subtract from it what the simulated value is across all other markets. Right, so that would just be isolating what were the idiosyncratic things about this job market compared to the typical one. And I'll see if you agree, and I think what you described about the alternative way of doing it, that we're conditioning on own AFQT. And so I see that as like a summary statistic for what the expected mismatch, would be in other markets. Okay, you and I know what we're talking about. Okay, good. So so we're holding constant ownability level and then using this variation in mismatch that comes from the available jobs and the ability level of peers. And this I will describe as well if the font's too small. This was just a graphical illustration of one example job spin, and it had like 70 people. I just grabbed the folks at the top. And so this shows individuals ranked by their AFQT. It shows what their actual job AFQT was, what their simulated job AFQT was, actual relative ability, what their simulated relative ability was. And these are some examples of the names of the jobs. There's nuclear forensics, network integration, electrical. Okay, and all these people are competing in the electronics career field. So something you'll see is when we rank folks, we have people who have the same AFQT, and so they're basically tied in this ability measure. What we do is we randomly rank them. We do the job simulation. We slap in those simulated job AFQTs, and then we just average. So everyone who has the same AFQT ends up with the same predicted average job AFQT. Okay, and we could do it different ways, but that's what we do. So that we deal with ties by just averaging after we run the process in a random way. Okay, but something that you may or may not be able to see in this figure is the person who's in the third row is someone who has a very high AFQT, so they're 95th percentile, in a job that's at the 59th percentile. Okay, and so that's someone who's really overqualified for their job. And this is, we don't know why. Like, why did they end up in that job? And this could be due to preferences, right? This is someone who said, no, I really want to do that. And so that's exactly what our instrument is designed to get rid of. Okay, that we're only going to use the variation in job assignments that comes from this variation in job ability, others' ability, assuming strict ability ranking. Okay, so that person is simulated to be in a much higher job than they end up in due to how high ability they are. Okay, these two figures are showing by bins of AFQT, going from lowest to highest, what the distribution of actual relative ability and simulated relative ability look like. Okay, so the dots in the middle are going to be the medians, and then the bars are showing the 90-10 values. Okay, and so the first one is going to be the actual relative ability, and what you're seeing with that upward slope is just saying that people who are higher ability are more likely to be overqualified. Right? So relative ability is going to be higher on average for higher ability folks. But you'll see that there's a lot of overlap across the distributions as well. Okay, when you look across ability bins, that there's overlaps in the relative ability across the cells. Not surprisingly, when we do the same thing for simulated relative ability, all the distributions are more narrow. Because we just pulled out that case that had a really large overqualification, right? And we've now we've shrunk that. Okay, so if you think about just in a given job spin, how would I get the minimum amount of mismatch? Is I would get it by doing strict assortative matching. Right? If I wanted to get the maximum amount of mismatch, I would do the reverse. Right? And that would give me as much variance as possible in mismatch. Okay, so when we use assortative matching, we're really shrinking that variance across these different groups. Okay, but you see the same pattern. And again, continue to see overlap across the different groups. Okay, so getting to results. So this is the first stage regression, where it's going to be, all of these regressions are going to be including the controls I've already described. So the cubic and AFQT, individual controls at entry, the career field by year fixed effects, and I think that might be all. If I forgot something, remind me. But this is just showing the coefficients from the first stage regressions on the two instruments. Okay, so predicting ability surplus, predicting ability deficit. And so what you see is, so the good thing about this first stage is that the diagonals are as we would have expected. Okay, so you see a much stronger influence of simulated ability surplus on ability surplus, and a much larger effect of simulated ability deficit on ability deficit. Right? That's just those diagonals. What's not expected is what we see on the cross diagonal, which is a larger simulated ability deficit predicts positively ability surplus. And the same is happening for simulated ability surplus and ability deficit. Okay, so those cross diagonals are not expected. And if we make our controls much more flexible, so add interactions with O and FQT, or if we really make the first stage more flexible, we can get rid of those off diagonals. But our argument is we're not trying to optimize the first stage. We're trying to have the right function for the second stage. And so for an instrumental variables estimate to be valid, the first stage does not have to have the right functional form. Okay, we just need that the errors are not correlated with these surplus terms in the second stage. Okay, so we're leaning into, we're trying to predict these kind of funky functions, that have these kinks in them with a very parsimonious model. And that gives us these funky cross terms, but we have good predictive power with the key instruments we're interested in, and we're going to move on to the second stage. Okay, so that is something I wanted to flag, is that we do have those unexpected cross terms. The F statistic here is an effective F statistic, so it's not overstated. Okay, so we do have really strong, and probably not surprisingly, because this is a setting where own cognitive ability is used in this job assignment process. Okay, so now I want to walk through the results for the different stages. I'm in the back. Are those hard to see? Yeah, okay. So I'll walk you through what's in the table. So there's going to be two pairs of columns for each outcome. Okay, so a pair of columns is an outcome, next pair is the next outcome, and the first is going to be OLS, the second is going to be IV. So the short run outcomes that we're looking at, so at the top it just has the ability surplus and ability deficit coefficients, is going to be, do these individuals graduate technical training? Okay, and that's going to be that first formal training they have for their job after basic training. And that's where we said that 94% do in fact end up graduating. So the OLS results, so I'll just help interpret all of these. So that's a positive for ability surplus. It says folks who are overqualified. If I'm overqualified by 0.1, right, 10 percentile points, I would be 0.008 percentage points more likely to graduate. Okay, and it sounds small relative to graduation rates, but it's large relative to dropout rates, right, which are only 6%. Okay, so being overqualified, more likely to graduate. Being underqualified, that carries a negative OLS estimate. So if I'm underqualified, I'm less likely to graduate technical training. Okay, so something that's super interesting is going from that OLS estimate to the IV, which is in column 2, the signs actually flip. Okay, so in the IV specification, we find that being overqualified by 10 percentage points lowers graduation by minus 0.02, okay, by 2 percentage points. So overqualification, less likely to make it through that technical training program for my job. And those who have an ability deficit, we don't see a statistically significant effect. Okay, but those, throughout our paper, all of the results we reject. So, and this is like the old-fashioned style test. So this P endogeneity, which is the third row up, is a test for are the OLS estimates the same as the IV estimates for these two variables. And I'm saying that's old-fashioned because now they could be different, and we'd be like, yeah, but they're both valid, right? That it could be a different local average treatment effect, and we want to acknowledge that. But to me, the pattern of results seem most consistent with the OLS estimates having been subject to selection bias, right? The person who we saw ending up with being really overqualified for their job, and especially the ones in the tails that had the greatest mismatch, for some reason, were well suited to that job, okay, and were more likely to persist. Those who, by luck of the job market, ended up being more overqualified, so in a less demanding job, they don't do well. Okay, and so I think it's more likely to do with the underlying selection bias, but want to acknowledge our test, the reason that we say, it was endogenous could be because of heterogeneous treatment effects. So who's shifted around across jobs because of our instrument. Okay, so the other two tests that we report in the bottom, so P linear and P absolute, are tests for whether we can reject a linear model, which means what if we just put in relative ability? Are these results consistent with the linear model? Or what if we imposed absolute value, okay, like the other, a lot of studies in the literature had, where it's really just about how different I am from everyone else. And we very often reject those two alternative models as well. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Okay, but that's a test we kind of carry throughout. So in the back, it doesn't matter if you see the specific numbers, I'm going to tell you qualitatively what the patterns are. When we when we take graduate on times, and from now on, I'll just focus on the IV results. Okay, that like I told you, that they're not always different in sign, but we can always reject that they're the same. Okay, if we take that graduate technical training result and we decompose it into graduating on time and graduating with delay. Okay, so there's two ways I can graduate. I can graduate the first time, or I can have to retrain, and I'm able to get through in a subsequent time. So if we look at those with ability surplus, we found that negative effect. So if I have a higher, if I'm overqualified, I'm less likely to graduate. It looks like that's kind of evenly split, or some part of it is due to I'm less likely to graduate on time, and some is that I'm also less likely to graduate with delay. If we look at those with an ability deficit, we didn't find an effect on graduation. So no statistically significant effect on graduation, but what that masks is opposing effects on these two dimensions. And those with a deficit are less likely to graduate on time, and that works against graduating, but they're actually more likely to graduate with delay. And this is where we start thinking we're seeing some of this motivation that, I struggle, right? So I'm going to have to repeat training, but these individuals are actually more likely to stick with it and ultimately graduate after repeating their coursework. Okay, and that last one is that composite outcome, which is graduating and scoring above average on the technical training coursework. We find, despite working against this, despite being less likely to graduate at all, those who have an ability surplus are more likely to fall in this category of being high achievers, okay, that graduating and scoring high. And those with a deficit, despite being more likely to persist and make it through, are less likely to both graduate and score high. Okay, and something that I'd be curious to see what you all think about this effort is we wanted to try to decompose this composite outcome or use this composite outcome to try to say, what can we say about the intensive margin effect, right? So you might want to know what's the effect of scoring high, being high achieving, getting into this high category, conditional on graduating, right? And that's not a regression we can run because we already have sample selection, right? If skill deficit or skill surplus affects who graduates, then we have a selected sample to look at for graduating and scoring above average. And so what we do, and this is just going to be a back of the envelope way of saying, does it look like there's any improvements on that intensive margin, okay, that among those who take the test actually doing better than they otherwise would, is we're just going to use the definition of this composite probability. Okay, so I'm going to use H for scoring high, conditional on a test, but you can think of it as like doing well, conditional on your outcome being observed. And then T is taking the test. And that's really just, are you observed? Because we have different types of outcomes. Okay, but I'll use the example where it's taking the test and scoring high conditional on taking the test. So this is the variable that we run in the regression is I scored high and I took the test, right? I graduated. So you can see my exam scores. We can decompose that in the probability of scoring high conditional on taking the test times the likelihood of taking the test. Okay, and that's just by definitions of probabilities. What we do in this next row is we take the derivative of that with respect to our treatment. So here we're going to do it for skill surplus. Okay, so just fully differentiating that probability with respect to skill surplus. And that's going to give us those two different composite terms. Okay, we have the probability of scoring high conditional on taking the test times the change in the likelihood of taking the test when I have a higher skill surplus, plus the likelihood of taking the test times the probability of scoring high conditional on taking the test and how that changes with skill surplus. Okay, so in this equation, there's some things we can directly estimate. Okay, so we would argue that we've estimated we can estimate the change in the likelihood of taking the test with skill surplus, right? We see whether you graduate or not and take the test, and that's not a selected sample, so we can estimate that term. The last term, which is this first term, it was what I showed you the results for, right? The change in this composite outcome when you're exposed to a higher ability surplus. The other things we can't observe are these two probabilities. So the right probabilities to use, the probability of scoring high conditional on taking the test would be for compliers, right? And that's not something that we can estimate with the complicated strategy that we have. And the same thing for the probability of taking the test, like the right things to plug in would be for compliers. Okay, so what we do is we just reorganize this equation. This is what we were after, right? The effect on the intensive margin. There's some things we can estimate using our IV strategy. And then what we do for those probabilities that we can't estimate is we just say, pretend the marginal is like the average. And so we plug in the average likelihood of taking the test and the average likelihood of scoring high conditional on taking the test. Okay, and that's a super strong assumption. Okay, but we see this as giving us a back of the envelope sense for whether there's any movement on the intensive margin or not. Okay, but that's when I'm going to show you. I'm going to go back to that table. These bottom rows are what's our estimate of that intensive margin effect. We get the statistical significance just by bootstrapping. Okay, so based on bootstraps, whether it's statistically significant or not. And so if you look at the very last column, column 8, so we find, by that strategy, we find a statistically significant effect on this intensive margin, like the likelihood of scoring high conditional on taking the test. That's not going to be surprising in this example, because I was just explaining, we find that folks who have a higher skill surplus are less likely to take the test. Nonetheless, we find that they're more likely to score high, take the test and score high. Okay, so the selection's working in the opposite direction, so it must be that they're also performing better. Okay, so when they move in opposite directions, it's not surprising what we find. When they move together, then it's a trickier decomposition. Okay, and the same thing goes for the deficit, where we find that there's a reduction, worsening of performance on the intensive margin, and that's because we're more likely to see them. Right? They're more likely to graduate. We're going to see this training score, but they're less likely to be in the top, above the median. So you don't look too disgruntled, so that's good. Back of the envelope. Okay, and then turning to the medium run results, so it's still going to be the same structure where the pairs of columns are OLS and IV, and I'm just going to focus on the IV results. We've got 2-year attrition and 3-year attrition, 2-year behavior and 3-year behavior, where these are just indicators for, have I tritted or not, and have I committed any crimes. So these are attrition's not so rare. By 3 years out, about 14% have attrited, but criminal behavior is quite rare. So by 3 years, it's around 4% have committed crimes. And what we see is that those with an ability surplus are more likely to attrit, and this looks like it's magnifying relative to the, we knew some already were gone because they didn't graduate. Now more are gone because they've attritted since technical training. And then we have that those who have an ability deficit are less likely. Greater ability deficit predicts lower attrition from the military. And on the behavior side, they go in the same direction. Okay. Bigger surplus, more likely to be involved in criminal behavior. Bigger deficit, less likely. Okay, so these we both view as signs of motivation, because these are things that are largely within individuals' control, especially after they graduate technical training. Okay, as long as I'm performing well and doing my job, then I'm going to be able to persist. Okay, and the long run results that we have are the ones related to this promotion that's 4 to 5 years out. The first, and for this one, just because this won't make you so happy because I don't think it's that much bigger, but I dropped the OLS just so the table would be easier to see. So we've got being promotion eligible, being promotional eligible and scoring above average on the job score, eligible and above average on that general U.S. Air Force knowledge exam, having perfect, being eligible and having perfect performance evaluations, and the last column is promoted. And so some of the patterns here, I would think of what's in the first column again as related to effort, like do I stick around and do I work hard? Am I trying to really climb up the ladder within the military? We again find a surplus is negative for that, a deficit is positive. When we look at knowledge on the job, so actually the skills that you're learning, your mastery of the skills on the job, those with a skill surplus, despite being less likely to even be promotion eligible, they're more likely to be promotion eligible and score above average on that exam. And that's what's going to make them one of the inputs to the promotion decision. And those with a deficit, same thing, they're more likely to be promotion eligible, but less likely to be promotion eligible and score above average on that exam. Okay, so this job achievement variable works in the opposite direction for surplus and deficit. And then to me, the flip between columns 2 and 3 is super interesting. Right? The general knowledge exam is common to everyone. Okay, so you can put us on a vertical scale. It's not relative to others in the same job. And we find that those with a skill surplus are less likely to be promotion eligible and score above average on that exam. Okay, and that's one that's showing something about your commitment to this job and this position. Okay, while the reverse is true for those with an ability deficit. And when it comes to perfect performance evaluation, same thing. Okay, those who are overqualified, less likely to get perfect performance evaluations, and those with the deficit, more likely to. When it comes to the ultimate promotion decision, having a skill surplus is beneficial. Okay, those with the skill surplus are more likely to be eligible and promoted. Those with the deficit, less likely to be eligible and promoted. And those effects are actually quite huge, given what the base is. So in the overall sample, only 18% are promoted in their first attempt. So I won't make you suffer through any more tables, but we do robustness to things. So something that might already have been in your mind is that we were using the variation in people who started basic training with me, as you might think that there's some sort of peer effects at play as well. And so we show that we're robust to controlling for average peer AFQT in my entering cohort, right? We're just relying on other aspects of the ability distribution, and for my relative rank. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting work showing that relative rank can matter to outcomes, so that doesn't affect our results. We try broader job windows, defining the job market with plus or minus 4 weeks on either side of the week that I enter. As I said before, controlling for indicators for every possible level of AFQT. For heterogeneity, I'll just verbally describe what's interesting is we find that women are more sensitive than men to both an ability deficit and an ability surplus. And there is a large literature thinking about the deficit side, showing that women interpret negative signals as more negative than men do. Okay, and that's one thing that we think we're seeing here, is that if I'm working, if I'm underqualified, I'm getting signals that I'm maybe not up to task on this job, and that we see that women seem to respond more negatively to that. We also find similar patterns for Black individuals in the military, but not for other groups. Okay, now I know that I want to leave some time if there are any questions. I know it's late, but what we end with is just showing, getting a proxy for these outside labor market options by taking the codes, the occupation codes in the military, mapping them to civilian wages. And you're not going to be surprised that if I have an ability surplus, 0.1 increase in ability surplus is associated with 10% lower future by, potential, I should say, civilian wages. So I'm in a job that's going to be less well rewarded in the long run. And the reverse is true for those with a deficit. Okay, and here we have estimates for some of the costs in the military setting. We just happen to have them. And this is where I was saying that for an employer's perspective, like what are the lessons, right? When your employers are hiring individuals who might be over or underqualified relative to the cognitive demands of the job, is these trade-offs, right? If I hire someone who's underqualified, I might get a more committed employee. But that they're going to progress more slowly in mastering the job. Okay, and if I hire someone who's overqualified, they may, they'll have a very good chance of, if they stay, being a superstar, but I'm going to have to deal with more turnover. And so we think those are some of the general lessons from the paper. And I'll stop here. Yeah, thanks.
I was thinking the whole time about peer effects. So even like beyond the empirical strategy for dealing with peer effects, like conceptually, how is this different from that?
So we first I'll just talk institutionally that the peer effects. When you're in basic training, you're with a much broader group. So which job you're in is completely irrelevant. When you go to technical training, you join people from other cohorts who've washed back, and we're looking at one set of folks who come into these jobs that's enlisted personnel. You also join people who are reservists and from other categories. So any peer effects from those in the same job get diluted really quickly. Right after technical training, you get sent out. So the way that we do it is we control for the job market. So the set of people you're competing with. We control for the average AFQT score of the peers. So that takes out some of our identifying variation because it's mostly now coming from the jobs. And then we also control for your relative rank within your job market. Yeah, but there still is, those who are assigned to the same job, if I'm overqualified, I'm probably, just by the way the algorithm works, those that end up in the same job as me have similar AFQTs as me, as they're also going to be overqualified. And so that's a pure effect I don't think we have enough power to deal with.
Hi, Julie. I mean, that's a question you probably get a lot. How representative are these people in terms of how are Army fellows more motivated to do their work in certain ways, like as a civic duty, and will that make underqualified workers work harder, for example? And then you're underestimating that effect.
Yeah, so that's such a hard question to answer. We have, so I think we saw on AFQT that they're positively selected relative to the typical young person, so 18 to 24-year-old. I think it is pitched as an alternative way of getting a degree. So I think if you thought of folks who are going to community college, a lot of individuals who enter the Air Force aren't thinking of having a military career. The typical number of years that folks from our cohort stayed in were, I think on average it was 7 years. And so they're planning to have a post-military career. And so I think from that perspective, we can say maybe not that different, but they do go through this indoctrination, right? So they go through something that says, now you're moving from being a civilian to, you are going to be a non-civilian and you're going to take orders and respond to orders. So there is that indoctrination that is hard to say, how that generalizes. And I do think we're thinking the fact that we're finding these effects lining up with outside labor market opportunities, to me, tells me something about, and this applies to any job, right? If I happen to get a good job in the private sector. But I see it as sort of the luck of the draw where I'm like, oh wow, I got a job that's really valuable. It's going to give me good training. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing the response to. Oh, and one follow-up is that we're also comparing people with the same skill level, right? The same ability level. So it's that takes out at least that piece, that my ability level relates to my effort.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, because you can see the actual job that the person got in the military, and I was thinking if there was some way with these simulations to interact it with the variance that they see on the same kind of profession that they got in a way in the civilian side. Like if I'm in the military, I'm overqualified, but I see that my outside opportunity is like maybe a civilian job, but it's a very small distribution. Maybe I won't quit the Army, right? Because I have certain security. While if my ability in particular seems to be more rewarded, this difference in the private sector, maybe I'm more willing to move. So I'm thinking whether maybe you can collect that information for each job. Maybe, I don't know, do some simulation or something, and then interact it, that's all.
So I'm not sure this is going to answer exactly what you're thinking, but we've taken the AFQTs in private sector jobs and seen how they predicted wages, and it leads to similar relationships to what we're finding here. We've also used ONET to measure the cognitive demands of jobs, and those line up with the average AFQTs in the jobs. But I think what you're talking about is if we could look at not only how AFQT predicts average wages, but the variance. Is everything okay? And so I think we could easily do that. We could do that pretty straightforward, I think, using the occupation codes. Well, no, what you're saying is different. Occupation code variance. We could also do AFQT variance.
Yeah, I'm thinking whether there is it would be good if you see how much, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think that latter one is not as interesting in our context since we're conditioning on AFQT, but the aspects of the occupation beyond the average wage, I think we could use, yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. I was thinking about soft skills, and that maybe some occupations need more soft skills than other ones. So I think you had something like human resources or something like that as a type of occupation. So I was thinking whether in those occupations the being over-skilled or under-skilled is less important because IQ or whatever, it's not as relevant as in other ones?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that we tried to validate the average AFQT with the ONET data, which says, you know, here's the average skills that are required. So we find a really high correlation between average AFQT and the ONET job skill requirements, which means even at the bottom, it's a measure of the cognitive demands. But I totally take your point that there's going to be this, you know, portfolio of skills. Something that the Air Force has done more recently is they've collected personality variables at entry, not during our time period, but that would be super interesting to incorporate. You know, are you like the typical person who's in the job that you're in? But yeah, so I started by saying, you know, some of the advances in the mismatch literature has been, you know, improving on the way mismatch is measured. And ours is naive in the sense that it's just a unidimensional. Like we've picked a dimension to look at mismatch, but you know, even within our measure in the ASVAB, there's math, there's verbal, and so there are ways that we could unpack that.
Hi. So thanks for the talk. It was very interesting. My question is a little bit following up on one of the previous questions about how portable these results could go to the private sector, and in the particular way, because here it seems that in the Air Force, the way to succeed is by getting promotions. You cannot get wage raises or stuff like that. So maybe that scheme of incentives leads to this typical behavior that the overskilled, you know, do not perform that well, but then they end up getting the promotion, whereas the underskilled, you know, they need to do more effort, behave better, but then they don't end up getting the promotion. In the private sectors, you can get like wage increases, and so basically it seems that perhaps the incentives to continue to perform well, even though you may be overskilled, maybe less, maybe attenuated in the private sector relative to the U.S. force. Just wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
So part of what goes into the promotion decision are observable measures of, like, to be eligible to be promoted, you have to have been doing this continuing education, and those come with credits, right? So you can be working towards an associate's degree. And so the things that go along with making you successful at promotion are rewarded in the private sector. And also being, you know, coming out with a higher rank is rewarded in the private sector. But I take your point. So these are, to the extent they're wage returns, they're future wage returns. Okay, but those are things that are valued in the private sector, right? It's like we were, you know, a leader. You're basically now managing people if you're promoted at this competitive step we're looking at. Okay, but I take the point that you know, if we could observe post-military outcomes, that would be ideal. Off to the moro.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
SECHI would like to give you some present for us.
Oh,
You remember you did Chile, so I don't know who's upstairs.
Con esto hemos concluido el día de hoy. Sí, gracias. Con esto hemos concluido el día de hoy. Espero que hayan tenido una jornada académica fructífera. Y ahora tenemos los buses que nos están esperando saliendo de este parque al frente.